Don't be around when we leave for Italy, my brother Kieran said during what I thought was a casual family dinner at my parents' house in Millbrook Heights. I laughed it off as typical sibling rivalry, just Kieran being his usual dramatic self about our family's upcoming vacation to Tuscany. But when I discover what he really meant 3 days later, I realized my entire family had been orchestrating my complete financial and emotional destruction for over 8 months. Here's how one seemingly innocent comment at Sunday dinner exposed a conspiracy so calculated and cruel, it shattered every assumption I'd ever made about the people who claim to love me most. My name is Sophia Castellano, and I'm 34 years old. Up until that moment, I thought I understood my family dynamics perfectly. I was the reliable middle child, the one everyone came to when they needed practical help or emotional support. My younger brother Kieran was the charming troublemaker who could talk his way out of anything with his infectious grin and quick wit. My older sister Valentina was the golden child who seemed to effortlessly succeed at everything she touched. First in her law career, then in her marriage to a successful orthopedic surgeon, and now as the mother of two picture-perfect children. And my parents, Marco and Isabella Castellano, were the kind of old-school Italian-American family who valued loyalty above everything else. Or so I believed. The dinner that changed everything happened on a crisp October evening in 2023. I remember driving through the familiar tree-lined streets of Millbrook Heights, past the brick colonials and perfectly manicured lawns that had defined my childhood. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, creating that golden hour lighting that made everything look like a nostalgic movie scene. My parents still lived in the same house where we'd grown up, a sprawling Mediterranean-style home with terracotta tiles and climbing ivy that my father had bought during his most successful years running Castellano construction. I'd been looking forward to this dinner all week. Work had been absolutely brutal. I was managing 3 major client accounts at Morrison & Associates, the marketing firm where I'd been climbing the ladder for the past 7 years. The pharmaceutical campaign alone was consuming 60-hour weeks, and the stress was starting to show in the form of tension headaches and a persistent knot in my shoulders that no amount of yoga seemed to cure. There was something comforting about the promise of my mother's homemade lasagna and the familiar chaos of family conversation. When I walked through the heavy oak front door, the house smelled exactly like my childhood. Garlic, basil, and that particular scent of old wood and lemon furniture polish that seemed permanently embedded in every surface. The entryway still displayed the same collection of family photos that had been there for decades. My first communion, Kieran's high school graduation, Valentina's wedding, and various Christmas mornings that blurred together in a haze of wrapping paper and forced smiles. Mom was in the kitchen, her silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for 20 years, stirring something that smelled incredible on the massive 6-burner Viking stove that dominated the space. At 65, Isabella Castellano still moved around her kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding a family for 40 years. She'd immigrated from Naples as a young woman, and her cooking remained her primary way of showing love. Layers of meaning embedded in every carefully prepared meal. "Sophia, cara mia," she called out in her mix of English and Italian that always made me feel like I was 8 years old again. "You look too thin. Are you eating enough? You work too much, always with the stress." This was our ritual. No matter what was happening in my life, no matter how successful my career was becoming, Mom always worried I wasn't eating enough. It was one of those predictable family patterns that felt both annoying and comforting at the same time. I could be promoted to CEO tomorrow, and she'd still ask if I was remembering to eat breakfast. Dad was in his usual spot in the living room, settled into his massive brown leather recliner with a glass of Chianti and the evening news turned up too loud. At 68, Marco Castellano still had the broad shoulders and permanently calloused hands of someone who'd spent decades working construction, though he'd been mostly retired for the past 5 years after selling his company to a larger firm. His thick white mustache twitched when he saw me, his version of a smile. "How's work treating you, Soph?" he asked, reaching for the remote to mute the television. This was also part of our routine. Dad would ask about work, I'd give him a brief update, and he'd nod approvingly and tell me I was making something of myself. High praise from a man who believed that hard work was the only virtue that mattered. "Busy," I said, settling into the familiar burgundy couch across from him. 3 major campaigns running simultaneously. The pharmaceutical client is particularly demanding, but if we nail this launch, it could mean a promotion to senior director. Dad's eyes lit up the way they always did when I talked about career advancement. He'd never finished high school himself, having started working construction at 15 to help support his own family, and he took immense pride in what he saw as his children's success.
"That's my girl," he said, raising his wine glass in a small toast. "You always were the smart one, focused, not like these other two who can't seem to—" He trailed off as Kieran emerged from the basement, where he'd apparently been playing video games on the old PlayStation that somehow still worked, despite being at least 15 years old. At 31, my brother still had the lean build and easy smile that had made him popular in high school, though there were now permanent circles under his green eyes that suggested his party boy lifestyle was starting to catch up with him. Kieran worked sporadically in real estate, or at least that's what he claimed. As far as I could tell, his actual job was charming wealthy older women into letting him show them expensive properties they had no intention of buying. It seemed to pay enough for him to maintain his studio apartment in the trendy part of downtown Millbrook, drive a leased BMW, and maintain his wardrobe of designer casual wear that made him look like he'd stepped out of a men's magazine. "Smart one, huh?" Kieran said, dropping onto the couch next to me and stealing a handful of the mixed nuts Mom always put out before dinner. "I thought Valentina was the smart one, I was the charming one, and Sophia was the—" He paused dramatically. "What were you again, Soph? The responsible one?" There was something in his tone that felt different than his usual teasing, a slight edge that I couldn't quite identify. But before I could analyze it further, Valentina arrived with her typical dramatic flair, sweeping through the front door in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely controlled chaos. My sister looked exactly like what she was, a successful lawyer who'd married well and had the resources to maintain herself accordingly. Her dark hair was perfectly styled in one of those cuts that looked effortless, but probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. She was wearing what I recognized as a designer wool coat over perfectly tailored pants, and her jewelry was understated but clearly expensive. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, though she was actually exactly on time. Traffic was insane, and Marcus had a last-minute surgery, so I had to handle both kids' pickup from school and soccer practice. She paused to air kiss Mom's cheek without actually making contact. "Something smells amazing, as always." Valentina had perfected the art of the humble brag. Every statement about her life managed to communicate both how overwhelmed and how blessed she was. Her husband, Marcus, was an orthopedic surgeon at the prestigious Riverside Medical Center. Her children, Enzo and Sophia, were enrolled in the most exclusive private schools in the city, and she'd made partner at her law firm 2 years ahead of schedule. Yet she always managed to present her successes as burdens, as if she were reluctantly bearing the weight of her own good fortune. "Where are the kids?" Mom asked, beginning the familiar dance of setting out her best china and crystal glasses that only appeared for family dinners. "Marcus has them tonight. Date night for us tomorrow, so I figured I'd give him some father-son time. Well, father-daughter and son time." She laughed at her own correction. You know how he is with them, still trying to figure out how to braid Sophia's hair. The conversation continued in its predictable pattern as we moved to the dining room table. Mom had outdone herself. The lasagna was perfect, accompanied by Caesar salad, garlic bread, and roasted vegetables that managed to be both healthy and indulgent. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood. The heavy wooden table that could seat 8, the matching buffet displaying Mom's collection of ceramic serving pieces,
and the chandelier that cast warm light over family meals and holiday celebrations. We talked about work, the weather, local politics, and Valentina's children's various activities and achievements. Kieran regaled us with stories about his latest dating adventures, carefully edited to remove any details that might scandalize our parents. I shared updates about my campaign work, and Dad asked thoughtful questions about marketing strategy that reminded me he was actually quite sharp when it came to business matters. It was during dessert, Mom's famous tiramisu that she only made for special occasions, that the conversation turned to their upcoming trip to Italy. "Only 2 weeks now," Mom said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I can't believe we're finally doing this. 43 years I've been talking about taking your father back to Naples to see where I grew up." The trip had been in planning for over a year. It was a big deal. Mom's first time back to Italy since she'd emigrated as a 22-year-old bride, and Dad's first vacation that lasted longer than a weekend since he'd started his business. They were planning 3 weeks. A week in Naples visiting Mom's remaining relatives, a week in Rome playing tourist, and a week in Tuscany staying at what Valentina had described as the most incredible villa rental you've ever seen. "The villa photos are just gorgeous," Valentina added, pulling out her phone to show us pictures she had apparently already seen multiple times. "Look at this view of the hills and the wine cellar. Dad, you're going to love the local vineyards." Dad beamed with the satisfaction of someone who had worked hard his entire life and was finally able to afford something truly special. "Your mother deserves this," he said, reaching over to pat Mom's hand. "She's been talking about showing me her grandmother's house since we got married." "When exactly do you leave?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the dates. "November 15th. We land in Rome, spend 2 days getting over the jet lag, and then take the train down to Naples."
"And you're all set with the house-sitting situation?" I continued, knowing they'd been mildly stressed about leaving their home unattended for so long. This was where the conversation took its first strange turn. Kieran and Valentina exchanged a look. Quick, but not quick enough that I missed it. It was the kind of glance that passes between people who share information that others in the room don't have. "Actually," Valentina said carefully, "we've decided to handle that ourselves. Kieran's going to stay here while they're gone." I looked at my brother, surprised. "Really? I thought you loved your apartment." Kieran shrugged, but there was something studied about his casualness. "It's temporary, and this place is bigger. Better for entertaining." Another glance between him and Valentina. Another small moment that felt just slightly off. "That's really nice of you," I said, and I meant it. Despite his flaws, Kieran stepping up to help our parents was touching. They'll feel so much better knowing someone's here. "Well," Kieran said, taking a sip of wine, and looking directly at me for the first time all evening, "it's important that the house not be empty. You know, we want to make sure nothing happens while they're gone." Something in his emphasis on the word empty made me pay closer attention. "Of course," I agreed. "Break-ins are always a concern when houses sit vacant for weeks." "Exactly," Valentina chimed in, though her voice had that slightly artificial quality it took on when she was being careful about something. "We just want to make sure everything stays secure." Dad nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. The house has a lot of valuables. My tools in the garage alone are worth thousands. Plus all of Mom's jewelry and the art collection." I looked around the dining room, taking inventory of what he might mean. Mom and Dad had collected various pieces over the years, nothing museum quality, but a few original paintings and some antique pieces that probably appreciated in value. There was also Mom's jewelry, including some pieces that had been passed down through her family, and the diamond anniversary ring Dad had given her for their 25th anniversary. "It really is smart to have someone here," I agreed. "I could help too if you want. I could check in on weekends or if Kieran needs to travel for work or anything." The silence that followed was just a beat too long. "That's sweet of you to offer," Valentina said finally, "but I think Kieran has it covered." "Yeah, Kieran added, and now his tone was definitely different. Sharper. Besides, you're so busy with work right now. Didn't you say you're working 60-hour weeks? Well, yes, but... And you've got that big pharmaceutical launch coming up. The timing really wouldn't be good for you to take on additional responsibilities. I felt a small flicker of something... hurt, maybe? Or confusion. It seemed odd that they were so quickly dismissing my offer to help. We'd always shared family responsibilities pretty equally, despite our different schedules and commitments. I just meant I could swing by occasionally. It wouldn't interfere with work. Really, Sophie? And his voice carried a finality that surprised me. It's better if it's just me. Less complicated that way. Mom, who had been quietly clearing dessert plates, looked up with a slight frown. Why would it be complicated? Sophia's always been so helpful. It's just easier if one person is responsible. That way there's no confusion about schedules or who's supposed to be here when. The explanation made logical sense, but something about the way they were tag-teaming the conversation felt orchestrated, like they discussed this ahead of time and had their responses ready. Besides, Kieran continued, leaning back in his chair with what looked like forced casualness, you probably shouldn't be around here much when we're getting ready to leave anyway. You know how crazy travel preparation gets. And that's when he said it. In fact, I think it's better if you don't be around when we leave for Italy. The words hung in the air for a moment. Everyone kept eating, kept moving, kept acting like this was normal dinner conversation. But something about the way he'd phrased it, don't be around rather than don't worry about helping, struck me as odd. I laughed, trying to lighten what suddenly felt like a heavy moment. What, are you embarrassed to have your sister see you being responsible? Kieran didn't laugh back. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He's something like that. The conversation moved on to other topics, Mom's packing list, Dad's concerns about international cell phone plans, and Valentina's recommendations for restaurants in Rome. But I found myself only half listening, replaying Kieran's comment, and trying to understand why it bothered me so much. It wasn't until I was driving home later that evening, navigating the familiar streets back to my own apartment across town, that I realized what had felt so strange about the entire interaction. For the first time in my adult life, my family had excluded me from something. Not just excluded me, they'd actively discouraged my involvement. And they'd done it in a way that felt coordinated, like they'd planned exactly how to handle the conversation. I told myself I was overreacting. Kieran was stepping up to help, which was genuinely surprising and commendable. Valentina was being practical about logistics. Mom and Dad deserved to focus on their trip without worrying about family coordination.
But as I pulled into my parking space at my apartment complex, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened at that dinner table. Something I didn't fully understand yet. Don't be around when we leave for Italy. The words kept echoing in my head as I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment. At the time, I'd interpreted them as Kieran's awkward way of saying he didn't need help. 3 days later, I would discover what he actually meant. And when I did, everything I thought I knew about my family would crumble in the space of a single phone call that would change the trajectory of my entire life. 3 days after that dinner, I was working late at Morrison & Associates when my phone rang. It was Detective Sarah Chen from the Millbrook Heights Police Department. Miss Castellano, I need to inform you that your parents' home was burglarized this evening. Your brother Kieran reported the break-in around 6 p.m. My stomach dropped. Are they okay? Are my parents... Your parents are fine. They're still in Italy, correct? The break-in occurred while the house was supposed to be empty. Supposed to be empty. But Kieran was house-sitting. Where's my brother? I asked, grabbing my keys. He claimed he stepped out for groceries. When he returned, the back door was forced open. Several valuable items were taken. Jewelry, art pieces, some electronics. We'll need you to come identify what's missing since you're familiar with the house. I drove to my parents' house with a growing sense of dread, Police cars line the street, their red and blue lights painting the familiar neighborhood in harsh, unfamiliar colors. Crime scene tape fluttered across the front porch, where I'd sat countless times as a child. Detective Chen met me at the door. She was a small woman with sharp eyes who spoke with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too much. "The burglars knew exactly what to take," she said, leading me through the house. "They bypassed the television, the computers, even left cash on the kitchen counter. Instead, they took specific high-value items that would be difficult to trace." In my parents' bedroom, Mom's jewelry box sat open and empty. The antique paintings from the living room were gone, leaving pale rectangles on the wallpaper. Dad's rare coin collection had vanished from his study. "Very professional," Detective Chen continued, "almost like they had inside knowledge of what was valuable and where to find it." That's when I saw Kieran in the kitchen, giving his statement to another officer. He looked appropriately distressed, rumpled clothes, worried expression, hands gesturing as he explained his grocery store alibi. But something was wrong with the scene. The back door, which had allegedly been forced open, showed damage that looked fresh, but superficial. The kind of damage that could be created from the inside to look like a break-in. More importantly, I noticed what the burglars had left behind. Dad's expensive power tools in the garage, untouched and easily accessible. Mom's good silverware, still in its case in the dining room buffet. Even her wedding ring, which she'd left behind for the trip, sitting in plain sight on her dresser. The burglars had taken only items that could be sold privately, leaving behind anything that could be easily traced or required pawnshop documentation. Your brother mentioned you'd offered to help with house sitting, but that they decided it was better if he handled it alone. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "Don't be around when we leave for Italy." Kieran hadn't been excluding me from family responsibilities. He had been protecting me from becoming an accessory to insurance fraud. My own brother had staged a burglary of our parents' home while they trusted him to keep everything safe. And he'd warned me to stay away so I couldn't accidentally expose his plan. I looked across the kitchen at Kieran, still playing the role of the devastated son whose negligence had led to disaster. When our eyes met, I saw something I'd never seen before. Cold calculation masquerading as family loyalty. That's when I realized this was just the beginning.